It's almost impossible to go through life without being hurt. And unfortunately, some people have been hurt worse than others. Sexual, physical, verbal, emotional abuse. It's happened to me and it's happened to you. Now what? We've been taught since we were knee high to a grasshopper that we need to forgive and forget. But is that possible, or is that just some really bad advice? Here's an interesting tidbit. For the human mind to store information and remember something, our senses have to capture it perfectly. And in order to capture it perfectly, whatever is taking place has to have our full attention. Our mind has to be fully engaged, firing on all cylinders. So when we go through a traumatic experience like abuse, neglect, betrayal, being stabbed in the back by your bestie, or some other experience that causes deep hurt, we are plugged in. And I think it's impossible to erase something like that from our memory. Does God even do that? Is it possible for God with an infinite mind to forget? Now we know that God is omniscient, which means that He knows everything. He's fully engaged with His creation and is always firing on all cylinders. So I don't think God forgets anything. However, I do think that He chooses not to remember some things. Through the prophet Isaiah, he says, even I am He who blots out your transgressions and remembers your sin no more. The writer of Hebrews states, their sin and lawless acts I will remember no more. Get this, choosing not to remember is what happens when forgiveness takes place. To forgive is to choose not to bring up the past and use it against the other person. This is what God does with our sin. When He forgives us, He chooses not to remember it, and He chooses not to use it against us ever again. Now, the only thing that God chooses not to remember is the thing that separates us from Him. The sin that destroys the relationship. The sin that breaks our fellowship. That's the only thing that God chooses to remember no more. No matter how small or great we see our sin, each and every sin is ultimately against God. Do you remember David in Psalms 51 and his confession to God about his sin with Bathsheba? He says, against you and only you have I sinned. Now, though we have sinned against Him, He sees us as if we have never sinned. And He relates to us as if we had always been as righteous as His Son, Jesus. This is what happened when God forgives. And so we have to ask this question. If God keeps no record of wrong, then why should we? And the answer is we shouldn't. Paul wrote to the church at Ephesus and said that we are to forgive one another, even as God in Christ forgave you. Like the Holy One who has called you, be holy yourselves in all your behavior. To be holy in all your behavior is an imperative. It's a command. So imitating God's holiness in our behavior is something that we're to do. And in His holiness, His mercy, and His grace, He chooses to forgive and keep no record of wrong. Therefore, neither should we. Think about it. What right do we have to hold a grudge when He's let them go? Why should we remind others of their past sin when God forgets ours? And if God keeps no record of wrong, then why should we? Someone once said that to not forgive is like drinking poison and hoping the other person dies. By the way, not to forgive creates more health problems than we care to know about. Anxiety, depression, high blood pressure, heart disease, ulcers, to name a few. Now, God demonstrates His love for us in that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. And God continues to demonstrate His love. As we turn from our sin, He chooses to remember it no more. And if we're called to be imitators of God, then we have to learn to forgive others as He has forgiven us. And when we forgive others, we choose not to bring up the past and use it against them. Don't carry that hurt around any longer. So let me ask you, has anybody hurt you? Are you mad at anyone? Is there anything in your heart that God never intended to be there? Will you forgive? Will you choose today to drop that baggage rather than carry it into another season of life? Choose to forgive. God bless.